Hi, this is Deboki, and today for Not My Thesis, I want to talk about the election. Yeah, because it's been kind of the dominating thought in my head the whole week. I'd actually had a completely different video in mind to work on this weekend. I was going to talk about bullet journaling. I will get back to that in a few weeks. I think next week I'm going to do a 16 positive things in 2016 video. Bree did one and I really appreciated it because this past week I definitely needed some more positivity. But for now, I don't want to get super political. I mean, there's a lot of that happening. My goal is not to make a solid argument about what I think is happening in the country, because there's a lot and I think it'll take some time to get through it all. I just want to talk a little bit about like my feelings, because that's what I do in this. I think in the past week I've had a lot of very visceral emotional response, like a lot of people, and I am still sorting through a lot of that. But I think with where I am now, I do feel like some of it has cleared away, or at least kind of cleared up in a way that for me elucidates what my frustrations are and what I am upset about, and what I am also maybe kind of hopeful for, and what it means for me. So this is extremely self-centered. I'm just putting that out there. I'm okay with that. In some ways, I appreciate when people talk more about their personal feelings right now, because there's so much analysis that we're all trying to do that I can't handle it, because none of us know. Like, so you can't, there are these hypothetical questions of like, oh, if Bernie Sanders had run, what would the election look like? I'm honestly not interested in that. I don't think it's productive that much. And I just really want to know more about where people's lives are at and how people think that they are going forward, whether it's for themselves or for other people. I mean, just going back to election night, I watched with some of my friends. I actually had a conference the next day, and so I was also trying to prepare a talk at some point that night. And it was, yeah, I mean, I've had my share of issues with anxiety, and it's been so long since I've had that feeling of a panic attack that it was almost to me like, is this happening? Like, am I actually on the verge of like a panic attack? Is me hyperventilating a sign of a panic attack? But that's where I was, and I had a really hard time sleeping. I mean, it brought me again back to when my issues with anxiety were more severe. I basically had to put on a reality TV show, which is something that I used to do when I couldn't sleep. For some reason, the sound of women yelling at each other is really soothing, which says a lot more about me probably than, you know, valid approaches to treating your anxiety. But it is a thing that helped me sleep. I still only got 4 hours of it. I woke up an hour earlier than I needed to, and I did not have the energy to get through the day, but somehow I did it. And in a way, I'm glad that I had this conference that I was at. It was a conference / workshop for women in my field who are kind of in transition in their careers. And I'm really glad, because I think if I had not had that conference, as exhausting and painful as it was to like be awake and to be thinking about things that are not the election, I am also glad, because if I had been at lab, I would have just been sitting on my computer reading people's posts about what is going on. And I'm glad I couldn't do that. I'm glad that I was forced to take a step back and not be engaged on the internet. With that said, I've found the internet really helpful for me in these times. The way that, you know, the internet is good at any time you need to find a few people to commiserate with. I've had good conversations with people, like in real life, like on the phone, in school and stuff, and I've had conversations with people in different corners of the internet. Talking it out with friends in whatever circumstance has been helpful, and I think it's been really validating, because especially like when you're having almost a panic attack on the night of the election, it's so easy to second guess yourself and be like, is this really that big of a deal? Like, you know, it's the president. But when you talk to people and like you see that the response is as strong from them as it has been for you, it's incredibly validating, and it makes it much easier to process, because you're not caught up in constant questions of, is it okay for me to feel this way? So I am incredibly grateful for my friends, for talking things with me, for listening to my rants. I think some of my friends actually, while we were doing this, found my YouTube channel because they were on Twitter and like found it. So hey, if you're watching it, I appreciate you. So like I said, I don't want to get too much into the nitty gritty, I guess. I think there were a few things about what this election has felt like to me, or has looked like to me, and what some of the conversations looked like that I did want to touch on though. So one thing for me that just is viscerally was the most upsetting, I think I'm going to use visceral a lot in this, but yeah, so just like upfront, the most upsetting to think of, like just the image of it, is thinking of Hillary Clinton in the debates being so smart and competent and just clearly talking to this guy, not even to him, just like on a stage, having to treat this guy who is not prepared for anything, for any aspect of this, as her equal, and then lose the election to him. It's just, like as a woman, I think a lot of women, maybe not all, but a lot of us have had an experience that's maybe not on that extreme, but that feels awfully similar. It just really hits a really sore spot for me, where even if it's not personal, it feels personal. And for me, it's incredibly hard to disentangle sexism and misogyny from how this election went. It's complicated, obviously, but I think it's a big part of what the story is, and I hope that maybe we can come to an understanding on that. In terms of the conversations that I've kind of seen going on, there's two things that I wanted to talk about. One is this common refrain that I think is coming up because a huge part of this election has been about racism, and even though it's been a huge part, people are very uncomfortable calling the Trump's voters racist. And I think especially people are trying to focus on the idea that there are economic explanations for why people voted for Trump. What I do want to say is that economic explanations and racially oriented explanations are not mutually exclusive. So one of the articles that I read was from the Harvard Business Review, and I'm trying to work on understanding more of this idea of the white working class, especially in the Midwest, which, like, it's not an area that I know very well. I am someone who grew up on the coast, and for, you know, even if I am a woman of color, I am also still middle class, and so there are things that I'm not going to understand, and so I'm trying to learn more. But I read this article in the Harvard Business Review that was basically talking about some of the issues that white working class voters maybe are especially concerned about, and how they're more focused on economic issues. And the author makes a really strong distinction between these economic issues and cultural issues, which she seems to define as, you know, issues of identity, and especially of being a minority. So she in particular points out transgender bathrooms, which I thought was a bad example because, like, that was not a bill that was initiated by Democrats, but whatever. Her whole point is that because Democrats have been focusing more on these cultural issues, the economic issues are not working for them. And I just want to say this, like, economic issues and cultural issues are not distinct ideas in this country. And really probably in a lot of countries, but in the context of America, like from the founding of our country, economic and cultural issues and race issues have been linked together. This country was founded on slave labor. So intrinsically, race and economics are related. We had a war fought over slave labor. There's been anti-immigration rhetoric passed, Jim Crow laws, voting laws, all of these things are related to economics and culture. Like, minorities are upset not just because they want to be able to live a life without being exposed to, like, bigoted language, for example, but because that prejudice impacts their actual economic livelihood. This is why we have issues like the pay gap, which doesn't just break down by gender, but also by race. And gay marriage was not just an issue about respecting the validity of people's relationships with one another, but also about a lot of the issues that come as a result of disrespecting that, which is that people don't have access to their partners in the same way as if they're married. So you can't disconnect them. Poverty disproportionately affects minorities of many different types. And so to say that they're somehow distinct from each other is aggravating to me, especially like our country has this long history where when there's economic unease in the majority class, there's a tendency to pin it on minorities, and this is true in America and it's true in other countries. And I think for me, having read The Making of Asian America by Erica Lee over the past year, which really gave me a sense of my place and, like, in the history of this country, I've gained more of an appreciation for how much work immigrants had to put in to get their rights. And that challenge came in part because of resentment towards them for their successes, or resentment that was held against them for the bad behavior of a few individuals. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that these two are linked together, because we're never going to be able to work past these issues if people are not willing to admit when their bigotry is a part of their decision making, whether it's an active choice to act to do something oppressive, or to make some kind of passive choice where you say that these issues are not important to me. And yes, I am also a part of this. Like I said, my understanding of the white working class is limited, and maybe that's where part of my opinions are limited as well. I don't know that learning more would change my stance on the vote. It really wouldn't. I mean, the things that Trump has said are despicable. Maybe I would gain more empathy towards the reason for placing that vote, or for feeling like they didn't have choices. I just think that we need to stop acting like calling out racism is just shutting down the conversation. The problem is we're not even getting to a conversation about race that's meaningful, because people are just so much more caught up in whether or not they're getting called racist than whether or not they're actually being racist. The other thing I have, like, regarding the conversation, which is like kind of like a side note, it's taking a complete stance back relative to the major issues of this election, is actually about data journalism. So these are things like 538/Nate Silver, The Upshot, and New York Times. There's been, especially with Nate Silver's success, especially with Nate Silver and 538's success in the last election, predicting how that was going to go. I think a lot of people look to this election to say, like, well, obviously they know what they're doing, so they're going to totally predict it. And so people were really trying to treat them as oracles. And because they got it wrong, both in the primaries and the elections, I think there's now this backlash against them where people are like, well, you don't seem to know what you're doing. And I think I've especially seen like some articles, I think Wired had one talking about how Sam Wang PhD is the new Nate Silver. And I get the impulse, but I just want to say that I think it's completely ignoring. I think that kind of impulse is also acting on an ignorance of how science actually works. So what I mean is that a lot of times when we talk about science to the public, not between scientists, but to the public, we're only delivering the results of a given experiment. We're saying, we did this experiment and we made this cool thing happen. And it makes it sound like science is very discrete, that it's just one discovery, another discovery, and another discovery. But science is not like that at all. It's a continuous endeavor, and really more a conversation that's been ongoing since, you know, whenever we first started knocking on shit to see what would happen. Like, this is a long dialogue between people who are making observations, making hypotheses based on those observations, and then performing experiments to test them. And if you get it right or wrong, that doesn't mean that you're bad, right? Like, you can have a prediction, get an answer that is contrary to your prediction, and that doesn't mean that you're a bad scientist or that you're not smart. What makes you smart or not smart is what you make of those results and plug in for your next attempt or your next for your next hypothesis. And so I find it frustrating when people are acting like, oh, there can be only one person who's good at this, because that's not how science works. It's not like there's only one physicist out there or one biologist. No, it's a whole world of people who are talking to each other from many different fields and many different approaches to explain why they think a certain thing works the way that it does. In addition, the 538 model is just that, it's a model. It can't tell you exactly what's happening. They're taking other people's numbers from polls and they're saying, with these numbers and based on some assumptions that we have made about how the world works, we think that this certain event will happen with a certain probability. The thing is that when you're saying that an event happens with a certain probability, that does not mean that that event is going to happen, right, in the actual observation. It does not mean that when we have the election that the winner that they predicted is actually going to be the winner. It'd be like if you said, like, you know, this coin, you have a 50-50 chance of getting a heads, and then you flip it and you get a tails, and you're like, well, that statement was wrong. Because that's not how probability works. The point is that if you flip the coin multiple times, actually like thousands of times, you'll see that 50% of the time you get a heads, 50% of the time you get a tails. Now with the election, we can't run it that many times. We can't run it thousands of times. And we also don't know if all of the assumptions that we've made are true, including things like, is the polling data accurate? Is the way that, you know, we're dealing with the data is accurate? I'm saying we, I don't mean we, I don't do this. And so I think what I'm getting at is that the way that we interpret those results is more about how we discuss them than whether or not they're right. And I think 538 actually does a really good job of this for the most part. I remember the primaries, they gave like Trump like a 2% chance of winning, and of course they were completely wrong. And they had an episode on their podcast, which I actually listen to more than I read them, and they discussed the things that they got wrong, and they explained like, well, we actually don't have that much polling data for primaries, so that's part of what we got wrong. And I haven't listened to their post-election discussions yet because my ability to listen to these kind of episodes right now is a little bit limited. I am interested to hear their analysis because I think that this has a bigger, broader implication for science and how we talk about it. I think what I really appreciate about sites like 538 is that they're maybe our best shot for explaining the scientific process to a popular crowd, right? Like right now, like I said, when we talk about science, it's often just more about a specific result. But what 538 is really doing is they're doing science and they're showing people how it's done. They're very open about their model, and they're very open about, you know, what they're getting right and what they're getting wrong and what their assumptions are. And that's the way that science is done. That's the way we do it in the lab. Like I really think of them as a lab that's basically being run in a journalistic way, with rapid turnover of papers, basically. That's why I'm so strongly defending them, especially because, you know, I think some of the time that they got some more backlash was before the election, when they were predicting that Clinton's chances weren't as good, and people, especially those of us who maybe really were rooting for Clinton, were skeptical based more on their emotional desire to see a huge Trump loss than, you know, the actual facts. Making this video even more self-centered, I think like a lot of people who have the same concerns, I'm at the point now where the issue is, what can I do? I just want to preface that by saying I'm not rooting for Trump to be a bad president. I just think his definition of being a bad president is different from mine. I hope that whatever it is that people who voted for him, as long as it's not like the wall or deporting people or banning Muslims, like as long as it's not those things, if it's something that, you know, is gonna actually like help their economic livelihood, I'm not rooting against that. But what I want to make sure is that the things that he is promising that are dangerous for people, I want to make sure that I am helping people so that it's not easy. Because it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be easy to do those kinds of horrible things to people on the basis of, you know, their race or their religion. So and some of those things that in terms of like what we can do are small, right? Like I think there's a lot of lists going around about different organizations to donate to who can, you know, help people. Things like, you know, obvious organizations like Planned Parenthood to help women with reproductive rights, and as well as different law centers and to help immigrants, groups to help transgender and gay youth. There are so many, and I think that they can benefit from our time and our money at a time like this. I'm also thinking about this in terms of what I'm going to do next. I'm hoping to be done with grad school soon, and I think a big part of my internal crisis, even like long before this election, has just been figuring out to what extent I want to do research after I graduate, to what extent I want to stay in academia, and there are times where I'm more strongly leaning towards one end than the other. And I think what this election has kind of made me understand a little bit clearer is that one of the frustrations I have with academic research, and maybe research in general, and academia in general as well, is that it's very easy to kind of get sucked into a bubble of just your research and just kind of really hone in on that, and that is the most important thing, and lose sight of the global picture. And the people who are able to do that, who are able to do both, like I'm really impressed with that. I don't know if it's something that I am really capable of or really still want to do in that way. So I am thinking more broadly about what kind of careers I want to do and what kind of jobs would be good for the perspective that I think I want to take on. And so I am thinking more seriously about jobs that I've thought about before, like science writing and science policy. And there's a chance I won't pursue those paths, but I think I'm taking those ideas a little bit more seriously now, because I just feel like for me to do the things I want to do, to make the impact that I want to make, I don't know right now if research is the way to do that. And I don't know if it's as in line with my values as I kind of initially thought of it as. I don't know. I mean, I'm also, like a lot of people, I'm still very much caught in a swing of emotion, and I know that things can change, and I know that there are people who do research who do really good things for the world and who are making important discoveries, even if they don't look important. And I respect that, and I'm just figuring out if that's the way that I want to do things. And maybe I will, I don't know. And so it sounds like I'm more in crisis than before, probably only because you guys haven't seen me in full crisis about this, but I do actually feel like I have more clarity about it. Like I have more clarity about why these other jobs have sounded appealing. And I want to say that for all of the negativity, there are things that I am optimistic about. I think the fact that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote is a tremendous relief to me. I think there's something very nice about that, even if she's not president, even if that doesn't change the fact that she's not president. There is something really good. I think I'm also taking a lot of hope and optimism from people's anger, if that makes sense. I know it comes off as super negative, but I think people are collectively in a place of just being like so jolted out of this idea that we had about how the US worked that will hopefully create some conversations that will move us forward and hopefully create a level of engagement that will help make sure that people don't get hurt and make sure that people don't have their rights taken from them. At least that's what I'm hoping for. So I think hearing about these protests and hearing people kind of talk about the harassment, there's a lot of negativity around that, but there's also just a lot of value in the fact that people are being aware of what these issues are. Yeah, I think that is the thing that I'm trying to kind of take from the most this week, whatever my sadness and anger is about how the election went. Yeah, like I said, this was like a more serious video. Next week I'll be more upbeat and positive. Hopefully that will be better. And yeah, bye.